All right, guys, before we get started on this final video here, I want to walk you guys through like some of the different ways that I approach details and texturing, right? We're going to be seeing the same technique repeated over and over. So I want to kind of take some time here and kind of show you guys some different ways to approach it, right? So we talked about primary shapes, which is the basic form, secondary shapes, getting into the secondary forms, some of the details, and then the tertiary shapes, right? It's going to be all like the pore detail, the fabric details, and all that stuff. So in ZBrush, there are a couple different ways to apply those details. So if I go here into a standard and I just grab an alpha, I change this to drag and rect, so I can just drag stuff into the model, and I grab an alpha, you would see, I can grab this arrow here, you'll see that I can just drag and drop this in there. If I change the focal shift, it's going to get sharper, right? So if I have alphas, and you can find alphas all over the internet, Google like any type of alpha, you can find it. Surface Mimic has a bunch of alphas that you could use, but basically you can find a bunch of stuff, a bunch of places. So if I had something that had a high frequency, I can start then creating some interesting shapes and patterns. I can come in this alpha and I can change the fade, right? And I can just kind of drag and drop it in there and get some interesting patterning with the basic alphas from ZBrush, for example, right? So from here, this will give me a nice base. I can come in here later on with the dim standard and then add some more variation to this, like if I'm making a creature or something like that. Like that's the one way to create some interesting variations and create something that feels like natural. Like that's one way to apply alphas, right? The other way is using similar alphas, but then using a surface modifier. So basically with this, so if I grab an alpha and I remove this basic noise, the way this works is that you would apply a planar projection into my mesh. So let's say if this was a fabric, right, I could get it like very sharp, very small, and get it in there. The problem is, and of course, it's going to stretch the sides. So for us to avoid these type of things, we either have to open this UVs and apply, instead of being a planar projection, do a UV base. Since I don't have UVs on this, I can't really show you guys, but you could use UV master, or you could, any way you want to open UVs so you avoid stretching like that. Or you could just, also mask this out, right? And then apply different projections. Now, it's going to be hard to control seam. Usually if I'm sketching, I would, just put a seam right here. So I could kind of like, save me some time so I don't have to worry about UVs. But basically I could project pore details. Fabric is probably the most important ones because you want to avoid, the reason why this one kind of works is because, there's no like specific seams. They have different variations. Like it's very kind of messy, but you do get some of these transitions a little more soft, right? So the way to avoid that is to use this little guy. So these are the two main ways to apply detail into the model. The other way, of course, is just sculpting by hand. But usually I use a mix of alphas and then I come back in and I sculpt some stuff by hand, right? I'll fix some of these, add some variations, just to make it feel more organic, more natural. That's kind of like the sweet spot. That's where you want to be at. Once you have that, there's a couple different techniques that we can use for texturing. The main one will be same thing, projection of colors using alphas. So let's say this guy is red and I want to have green details. What I would do is, instead of doing Z add, I'll do RGB and I'll click and drag those, that color information in here. And I could texture something to create some interesting variation like that. Or I could use a spray, for example, and also get some interesting color variation, using an alpha. That's another way to just get it, see like, get some interesting airbrush type of effect, right? So a mix of that plus, more kind of hard alphas. You can also use some texturing, like let's say you want to, also drag and drop some texture on top of this. There's also works. Make this white so you guys can see. This also works, you know, it's a mix of this texture with this alpha, and I'm just throwing that in there. This also creates a nice, interesting effect. Mix of that with masking. So once you have your mesh as details like this one, you could then start playing with masks and then do a cavity mask. You could blur that mask. So this way, once you start painting this, you know, let's say you're painting with a darker color, then you start getting some interesting kind of effects. So if I put it a flat color, you see I start painting kind of the model information into my texture. Like this has no shading, this is like a flat shading. And I could start then creating an interesting effect, right? Just on the highlights, just on the cavities. And I could easily, you know, paint this into something that looks nice, right? So these are kind of like the main, there's other techniques. You can project textures, you can use the app link, you could use, you know, spotlight. There's like, you know, a little more advanced techniques, but with this, you can, you know, create the same effects that I have on my works, because this is like 90% of what I use. So with this in mind, what we're gonna do, we're gonna take everything that we've built this far, and we're gonna add details, and we're gonna add color, and then we're gonna start finalizing this project and go from there. All right, so let's get back into all the models and get started with where we left off. All right, so I want to start with Hellboy here and take it from where we left off. One thing that I did here is I masked with the cavity and I forced those details a little bit more. But first things we're going to do is just throw in some pore details, and using the same technique, grabbing the drag rect brush type with like a pore alpha. And I got this pore alpha online. You can find it from even like oranges, or skin looks a lot like orange skins. So even if you want to create your own alpha for skin, like grab some high-res orange photos, or now you can probably find some high-res skin photos as well, and just make your own. So I'm just drag and dropping just to get some sort of variation. This is very important now, and we talked about this before, but just keep an eye on how the spec is behaving. Like I want to go into areas that the spec looks kind of flat or too plasticky, and I want to add that variation. Once I have all that in place, then we can start doing some of the techniques that we talked about. I'm masking by cavity now, trying to get all those details to pop, and I'm inflating it in. So I'm taking all the information that I have on my sculpt, and I'm masking by cavity, and I'm pushing it in a little bit just to get the sharpness back. So what I'm gonna do now with this fabric here, the leather actually on the jacket, is just grab like a leather alpha and just drag and drop it in there. I'm not worrying too much about the seams between those alphas like we talked about. This is more of, a little more random placed. I could just mask it out and then use the surface modifier, noise maker, and apply that alpha. It'll be a lot more crisp. But again, I'm not going too deep into the details on this. I just want to show you guys how I would do it differently. But in this case here, I'm just going fast and just literally just drag and dropping some alphas into place. Moving now into like just different parts of the body. As I'm doing this, I'm merging the parts that are similar together. So like all the leather, all the jacket now, I'm merging into the same subtool just to start organizing my file, since I'm gonna start having all these other characters into the same scene. Like right now I have too many subtools. I have 50 plus subtools. And as I start merging them together, all the skin together, I'm gonna have only a few of them. So now I'm gonna, jump into the face, kind of crunching a little bit of those details that we had before, adding a little bit more of those kind of scars or cracks into the horns, dragging and dropping some of the pore details into it. You're gonna see that it's a lot more straightforward. This part I do not want to go crazy with. That's not the point of this, of like just go crazy with the details. I want to make sure my secondary shapes are the things that are standing out the most. The details are there again to just break up the spec so things don't look plastic. You find, like, even if you start looking at a lot of other people's work where the skin just feels like plastic, or there's not enough specular breakup into the skin or all the objects. We want to make sure we're going in, breaking up that spec. Then we're going to start working with masks like what I'm doing here to just add that cavity using the mask, the sculpt information that we have. Another thing that I see a lot is when people rely too much on the cavity for the work, right? Like we don't want the texture to be 100% cavities and just show off your sculpt, right? Like you want to have that variation on your sculpt, on your texture. So the texture and the sculpt should complement each other, not so much rely on each other. Of course, the texture, the better your texture will be, the better your sculpt is, right? Because the more information you have there, the more you can work from. But you want to make sure you're also coming in later and adding just variation on top. Dirt, this is what I'm doing now. I'm grabbing like a concrete alpha, which is very contrasted, and I'm adding that all over the piece, just to add like variation, add some noise, some dirt, so it feels that the character is a little more lived in. There's just more diffuse information happening, not just 100% my cavity. That helps a lot. Finding an alpha that has a lot of contrast in him. When you start dragging and drop it in there, you start to very very naturally start getting a lot of cool stuff happening that you wouldn't be able to create if you're just painting it yourself. So you can get it very quickly, some cool variation. It's the same thing that I'm doing here on the arm, painting in the cavity by hand a little bit, adding a little bit of contrast and dirt on the cracks. That's another thing you should always kind of keep in mind. The areas that would have some occlusion, the areas that pieces are touching each other, like you can go in there and add a little bit of darkness into it, like a little bit of shading, just so it feels like the pieces are close to each other, or maybe there are dirt that's building up. That always helps with kind of making it more believable. So moving into Ape now, we're going to use different techniques for this one, where the alphas that I'm going to use, they're a lot more contrasted because I want to create that cool kind of like pattern vibe to the skin. And it's not very easy to create, but if you have the right techniques or the right patterns, like you can get some pretty interesting results. What I'm doing now, I'm just splitting up the body from the pants, because when I sculpted that, it was all one piece. But since we're going to start adding texture, and later on we're going to be dealing with just different surface treatment, different shaders, I want to make sure they're separate pieces. But once you have that, I'm just going back in there and refining some of the folds, adding a little bit more of the sharpness that we talked about when we were looking at the cloth part of the tutorial. I want to make sure I have those sharp edges, and I'm just using standard and clay to get that sharpness into the folds. I'm splitting it up, all the materials, like metals will go with metals, leather will go with leathers, skin will go with skin. Again, just to keep it organized, and later on if I export this out of ZBrush, I have it all as part of the same subtool. And now that we have that, we're just going back in and we're just refining the sculpt a little bit. We didn't spend a lot of time adding detail on this guy, and this guy should have a lot of skin detail. I'm adding a little bit of variation into the patterning of the face. I want to make sure it's not just the one kind of like straight line, very graphic. Even though it's a very graphic pattern, I want to make sure that I add some of the subtlety into the design. Every time I do skin patterns like that, I do go back and I start adding more color variation within the patterns, because that's kind of what makes it a little more natural, a little more realistic. And we're going to start doing that with this guy in a little bit. Right now we're just working with damp standard, coming in without alphas. Again, we just sculpting some wrinkles by hand. Later on, when we come in with alphas, it would add that extra kind of touch to how believable it is. But for now, just the damp standard is enough. Another thing for skin that is very good, I think Jordan Duchel does a lot of great job like that. Steve Wang, just learning from those guys, is just creating like a gradient on their skin. Make sure the limbs are either darker or lighter than the body, just to have that contrast. And the back of the body is the same thing. Usually when creatures have patterns and things like that, their back, or either their back or the belly, there's always like an interesting contrast that we can play with. And here I'm just using like a very simple alpha with some bumps, and I'm coming in and helping with that transition. So I did paint the back a little darker just with a flat gradient color, and now I'm coming in with the pattern just to have that nice transition to 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 the feel of the mesh, or of the texture, excuse me. And then I can come in with the same pattern with a lighter color and then go the other way around and help with the transition from light to dark as well, which is kind of what I'm going to do next. So there's a lot of cool stuff like that for creatures, and you can see me doing that now. I'm going inverted the colors and I'm coming into the light, and it's going to add some nice contrast into that transition, and it's going to make a lot more interesting. If you look at the traps right now, there's a lot of cool transition happening, and that's all like pretty much procedurally, because I'm just drag and dropping all these alphas. I'm not really painting in anything by hand, but we can get some really cool results just with just with poly paint and drag and dropping a lot of that stuff into the model. Like, I can't really go too deep into the skin treatment here, but a lot of the things that I'm trying to do is just the cold skin with the warmth of the skin. So if we're gonna go with the limbs and the pieces that are kind of like these flaps around the eyes, around the mouth, I am gonna try to do more of, a little bit more of a warm color, because his skin is so cold, right? Like the greens and the blues, like there's a lot of cold happening. So I wanna add a little bit of that variation with the skin, with the light and the blue. So if you look at the flat colors right now, you see there's tons of information going on just with those alphas. And what I'm doing now, I'm masking with the cavity, and then I'm filling in, just very subtle, but I want to have that information as part of the diffuse, but very subtle. I'm not overdoing it, right? Once we do that, all that stuff pops. And once we go to shading or doing renderings and stuff like that, you will notice the difference, right? I'm just going back in now and just breaking it up, the mesh a little bit more. I wish I would spend a little more time on him. There's a lot of things here, though, especially on the detail part, where it's just kind of like drag and dropped just to try to get the details in. But I would like to go back and really refine those tertiary details a little bit more, just to get it to look even better. So, but we're gonna keep moving. If we go to this guy, which has a lot of clothing, everything that we're gonna do here, pretty much everything that we're gonna do here is mask based. There's a lot of information on the sculpt, and once we start doing masking, similar to what we did early on, all those folds will come in pop, because there's a lot of information we can pull from. I'm also adding like that variation, same thing that we did with the other character, with a little bit of a lighter color of his base diffuse, just drag and dropping that stuff in there to add that color variation without needing much. Just a contrasted alpha, now going with the leather, just adding that kind of layer of kind of things feeling used, setting a little bit of the age in there, like the dirt of the connecting points. Again, looking at connecting or touching pieces, like how can we make that a little bit more believable. Always thinking about that. And you saw me doing the cavity, and very quickly this stuff starts looking pretty killer. All that detail comes to life and pops, and that's kind of what we want for this guy. Keep it simple. Everything is kind of leather anyways. Just having that cool variation on the leather, selling the believability, the age of certain pieces. For the skin, I'm just going in and adding a little bit of warmth around the lips and the nose and the cheekbones, just to have a little bit of color variation. But again, I'm keeping this guy very simple. I don't want to overdo it, since there's already a lot going on. And you see me talking about that all the time, making sure there's rest areas, and where you're putting most of your time is where it matters, right? Like that guy, he already has so much going on. I don't want to overdo it with a lot of texture. I want to make sure he reads clean and simple. Different than this guy, which he doesn't have a lot going on. We can go a little more crazy with the patterning. Same thing with Ape Sapiens. We could go a lot more crazy with the patterning on the skin and things like that. First, before on this guy, we're just going in and adding those details, going in with a damp standard, try to get everything represented before we start adding alphas, and then the alphas would just add that extra touch on everything. But I'm not relying on small details like that from alphas, because the alphas are way more procedurally. It does have that procedural look, so we don't want to start getting wrinkles and things like that, or pulling all that stuff from alphas. I want to add the alphas on top and then go back and add more wrinkles by hand, just to try to get it to feel unique and more organic, right? You see that easily with combinations of alphas and the DEM standard, things starts to look pretty flashy, and the result is pretty nice. We don't have to go too a lot crazier than that. If you want to go a lot crazier than that, it's just a matter of time, honestly, because the techniques will be the same. It's just more of like how much time do you spend on it, right? So now we just grab that very contrasted alpha, and I'm again throw it in the limbs, around the back, just to add some nice variation on the skin. And that mixed up with the cavities will give us a pretty nice result. This guy is red, like his skin is red. So I'm gonna, on the cavities, I'll put something that's a little cooler, probably come in with something that's a little more darker, like a darker red, and it should give us a nice result on the skin. I'm not going to do much with the teeth here since we don't see it as much, but I want to make sure at least they're represented in there. And basically we use all the kind of the same techniques for all these guys. Again, if you want to spend more on that, it's just a matter of time, how much alphas and colors and bring in references and real photos, and we can get
so
these
that's
guys
it for these characters.
pretty realistic or pretty stylized depending on what the goal is.
So that's it for these characters.
Basically on this, I could render this out in ZBrush. I do render a lot of my projects in ZBrush. I have a bunch of tutorials on that on my page. I also have friends that use Keyshot. I used Keyshot before. You can easily import these guys to the Keyshot and do some nice renders. The final one for these guys I did in 3ds Max using Arnold. Again, it's a very straightforward process. I just exported everything as is here with using Polypaint into 3ds Max, and then I rendered them using Arnold. But that's it for the sculpting process. I hope you guys enjoyed. I had a lot of fun working on them. I hope you guys picked up on a few techniques that will help you on your own projects. And let me know if you guys have any questions. Send me suggestions for future videos. I'm always open to sharing as much as I can with you guys and try to help as much as I can. So I really, really hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.